All right, so network attacks and countermeasures. Of course, these are the various attacks that we can always encounter within a particular network, right? And remember, we mentioned that a network comprises of integrated things, and these things are what we refer to as the system, right? So we can get attacks from different quarters, be it from application based attack. Someone may be trying to access our communication systems. These are forms of attacks. And also, the main attacks or the major attacks that we normally encounter are from software. We refer to them as software based attacks, and we're going to have a look at them. And of course, we are going to look at some of the countermeasures and expect us to understand these different countermeasures and how you can be able to apply them. So we are going to look at some of these, the software-based attacks. Those are what I refer to as malicious software, how we can protect ourselves from these, right? And of course, software-based attacks, you just need to have the countermeasures of software, like the antiviruses, have some restrictions or firewall restricting incoming traffic, like someone who is downloading stuff and uploading. I mean, we can always protect against that, right? We also have different categories of network attacks, and I've already mentioned we have social engineering attack, which actually is a very, very important attack for us to understand. We also need to have or identify the physical security attacks, and of course, I mentioned about the vulnerabilities. Physical security attacks, okay, they are within a restricted domain, or someone has to access the system, but realize that now the network based attacks are quite a number, right? So why are there frequent attacks on network system? Borrowing from what we looked at last time, we have the answer, right? So most of these attacks are carried out for malicious reasons, right? Maybe to cause some harm. Why? What motivates these kind of attacks? There are quite a number of reasons, right? See, these attacks are actually performed or carried out based on some different reasons. We are approaching a digital age where people are not even going to fight using physical weapons, right? So by just hacking into a country's network system, you can bring all the government services down, and that is just a war, right? So we can always have different reasons as to why people carry out these particular attacks, and majority of these attacks, they are informed by financial benefits. Someone wants just to maybe get some uh, finances, and that's why most systems or bank systems are normally attacked. We looked at the triad, the CIA, and we said that if these are compromised, then everything can be crumbled down, right? So we looked at integrity, where data can be modified. We looked at confidentiality, where unauthorized users access these particular systems. And of course, we also looked at availability, where we have denial of service attacks. So you can't be able to access given network resources, right? And of course, you have repudiation, right, where you can't be able to use the communication system. So all these forms of attacks, in a nutshell, can compromise either confidentiality or integrity or availability, right? So when you are trying to look at these attacks, we need to align ourselves, right? If it is in terms of confidentiality, how is confidentiality, first of all, compromised, right? When do we say that someone has compromised, or rather, an authorized user has accessed systems or data that they don't want, right? So is it maybe when someone is sending message? Is it when someone is spying into your computer data? Once you understand how this particular confidentiality can be compromised, right, then we can pinpoint the forms of attacks. After we have pinpointed the forms of attacks, then we can narrow down to the solution. How do we protect or prevent these? So we can have the various counter measures are put in place. So as we mentioned, this particular the triad, the CIA, if one of them is compromised, then the high chances that there will be an attack. So this particular table here breaks this particular compromise into three. So we can have, of course, threats, the consequences, and how we can, or the proper countermeasures. A good example is integrity. Integrity is when, for example, someone gets access to data in transit and modifies it, right? So when this particular person modifies this particular data, there are quite a number of consequences, right? They can use this particular data to do a lot of things. Either they can use this data to actually plant some malicious software in it, compromising our entire system. They can use this, right? Maybe delete this particular data at all, right? And it will create some vulnerability in other areas, depending with what this data is meant to be. So how do you protect integrity of data? Because normally this particular compromise happens when data is being transmitted. So there's a high chance that we should have systems. We can have the virtual private networks, or we can transmit data via VPN, right? We can also ensure that we have some hash functions that reinforces this particular, maybe that someone cannot be able to modify this particular data. We can also have the encryption, decryption using some private keys and public keys. All this is what we refer to as cryptographic mechanism. So we can always ensure that we reinforce this particular security so that integrity is not compromised. Now, confidentiality, as I mentioned, this is about getting information to the wrong user, right? So someone can be able to eavesdrop, right, and capture very confidential information. They can use this particular information to cause additional harm. Ideally, the consequence is that now privacy is compromised. And we can reinforce this by having secure protocols, by having some kind of web proxies that kind of divert unwanted traffic. We can have encryption, right? So these are some of the things that we can use. Denial of service attack is based on availability. So we haven't really written availability here, but there are quite a number of threats to this. Like, for example, killing of user threads. What is a thread? Yeah, what is a thread? You know, when you have a process, a process normally executes in different ways. So those different executions that originates from a given process are what we refer to as the threads. So if a user is attached to a particular process, let's say if a user is attached to accessing a database, for example, right? We normally have the database services that allows this particular user to access some functionality within a database. So what happens? The person who is interested again in the database can deprive this authorized user from accessing the database by maybe denying them access, right? So that's what we refer to as killing of user threads. We also have a scenario where an attacker or a hacker just decides to bombard or send very many traffic or unwanted traffic to a single network or to a single user, right? We normally refer to it as spoofing, right? So they can flood the machine with the necessary traffic. We're going to look at some of these denial of service attacks. They're quite a number, and all these might maybe lead to disruptive of normal network operations. They could be annoying, right? This is the worst form of attack, right? Because they are really difficult to handle, yeah, because they come from different quarters, as we are going to see. Then authentication. Authentication here, as we mentioned last time, is the ability to identify or ascertain who sent a particular message. How do you say, or how do you ascertain that this message actually comes from the person they claim to be, right? So it is a process of ensuring that you have legitimate users sending you that particular information, right? So if you have someone who is not supposed to send you that information sending you, then that chances are they could be using the sender's initial identification to pose as themselves, so that you send them this particular data. So authentication normally leads to what we refer to as fabrication, right? So when you're responding, you might think that you're responding to the legitimate sender, but you could be maybe sending to the wrong person. So we have such of these threats, like the man in the middle, right? So you send them this particular traffic. Uh, Now, we can also borrow the techniques we used within the integrity, because they are much related, right? Because this particular person can forge the sender's credentials and use them. So that means they can practice some kind of integrity issues. So we can borrow the cryptographic measures or techniques to reinforce this use of public keys and also use of private keys. We are going to look at introduction to cryptography and understand how we can reinforce security within this particular, using this particular technique. So having said that, we also are supposed to identify these software-based attacks. I normally refer to them as malicious softwares. There are very many, and that's why I say that you can take some time to understand them. There are very many. You see, malicious software, these are not just softwares that you can pinpoint that there are 10 or 5. Like when you talk about, for example, Trojan horse, right? A Trojan horse comes in different forms, right? So we have quite a number of malicious software: phishing, spoofing, rootkit, as you can see, right? So all these are techniques that are used by the hacker, or rather the attacker, to compromise the system. An example, as you can see, this ransomware, this is just a kind of software designed to maybe encrypt, right, a hard disk, for example. So one day you want to access the system, and you just you just see some funny face rotating around your black screen, yeah, telling you or sending some messages, right? That could be ransomware. And normally they're targeted at financial institutions with an aim of maybe getting some ransom. You see, ransom is some kind of financial payment, right, that the attacker requires for them to release or to decrypt for you your system, so that you can be able to access. I think this is one of the worst softwares, or rather technique, right? Because you really need to patch. Otherwise, you need to do some serious ethical hacking to bring the system back into operation. Now, we also have the rootkit. Now, I'm just pinpointing very, very serious malicious softwares. But as I mentioned, there are quite a number. You can do some research and find out the latest ones, right? Now, a rootkit A rootkit is whereby the attacker targets to use your system resources, right? So for them to use your system resources, they need to have the same privilege or permission or rights as you, right? So for them to manipulate your let's say processor, or for them to use your memory, they need to have administration or administrative privileges, right? So this is a particular program that they'll run or install within your computer, and it's going to give them those particular access rights, right? Or rather, what we refer to as the default permissions of your system. So you have to be very keen, especially when you realize that a system or rather a computer has some funny programs that are installed, or if you look at the panel that shows how resources are being utilized within this computer, you will figure out how, or the programs that are utilizing the CPU resources, and maybe find out if these are programs that you are the one who installed, right? Because that's why they require these particular privileges, because you might be having different administrators handling these different systems. More so, this form of attack is targeted at the supercomputers, such as the server. We also have the backdoor virus. This is a Trojan, right? What do you mean by backdoor? If you have the legit door that you use to get into your house with, then realize that someone else has formed another door. So they can equally access whatever you're accessing within your house, right? So these are kind of malicious softwares that are used to access, or rather to gain access to your system secretly, and of course you'll get confidential data. Now, backdoor virus normally try to look at vulnerabilities within the system. More so, they check the ports, right? You see, a port, we are going to, no, that is not, actually we have what we refer to as a socket. A socket is where you have IP address plus the port of a computer, right? So if this particular person can use your IP address and access and use some kind of unsecured ports, they'll check unsecured ports, they'll scan for the ports that are not secured within the system, and they can use those particular ports to plant or rather access your system without you knowing. So these are very dangerous. Now, talking about malicious software, so I'll just run through several. We also have viruses. I think you guys are very familiar with viruses. Now, I don't know, but you will agree with me that nowadays you don't have viruses. Yes, they are there. But 10, 15 years ago, we used to have very vulnerable, for instance, systems and operating systems, right? So it was like a playfield where hackers could just create programs and push them outside there. So we had a lot of viruses. But with the improved operating systems and hardwares that we have nowadays, I'll tell you that this threat is actually minimized. I'm not saying that it's 100% handled, but the level, or rather the threat level of viruses have really been reduced, right? So going forward, we hope the systems will actually also be able to handle this particular viruses 100%. So this is something that you can get online by downloading files, for instance, right? Accessing websites that are not secure. So viruses are those self-replicating softwares. Now, viruses are very lethal because comparing them to maybe worms, a virus, once it attaches itself to a particular file, there are very less chances that you can secure that particular file, right? Unless you have a very powerful antivirus. But also it depends with your response. We mentioned about the business continuity plan or the strategies that you can use to respond to an incident or a disaster. So if you realize that there's some elements of viruses within a system, it's actually recommended that you scan the system immediately. But if you take time, they might attack different applications and it will be very, very hard to handle them. So there's not really 100% way of, so we just need to keep on adjusting our levels of securing our system using antiviruses, anti-malwares, and so on. Now we have worms. I normally refer to them as the sister to the virus or the brother, right? They're more or less related. But the threat level of a worm is really not as lethal as a virus. Now worms, you can handle them, right? Because what happens with a worm replicates. They create some copies. Like for example, if a worm attaches itself to a particular, let's say, Word files, what it will do is that it's going to have different or many copies of that particular Word file. So what happens? By the time you maybe notice that there's worm, you are running out of disk space. So like you had 20 GB free of space, and just within some few minutes, it's telling you, my friend, you are running out of space. So you're wondering, I didn't have any video files here. So what is happening? So chances are those are worms. So where do we get these worms? Normally through, of course, files that we download from these from internet sites, right? So once they land onto our computer, they'll start replicating or creating different copies, and they can render your hard disk useless. They can eat your memory and so on. Now the good thing is that at least you can recover by running or having some anti-malwares in place. Of course, you can also still use these antiviruses. They have a component of clearing these particular worms. We had a famous one that really spread and it really hit the world. This one was referred to as the code red worm. There are quite a number of worms. Maybe you can do some research. We also have the family of these viruses. We also refer to them, or worms refer to them as adware, spyware. Now these are just some kind of creation of these threats that you get from the internet, right? Especially when you visit a site and you just have a very disturbing, right? You get a very disturbing.
Excuse me. I'm one.
Now for the hardware, uh, not really hardware. For the hardware, is that you'll always get them when you visit uh, a specific website that are not secure. Now, the countermeasure to this, of course, is to ensure that you can be able to filter or rather uh, have some kind of firewall to block these particular ads, maybe from appearing within your network. Now, they normally say that not all hardwares are really bad, but you can't really differentiate. It's very hard for the user. I normally have, or people normally have some softwares just to stop those particular ads from displaying. So it depends with the policy of your organization on how you handle those particular hardwares. As I mentioned, when these particular hardwares originate from websites that are not secure, there are high chances that the attacker is going to plant something using this particular hardware. This something are the bad cookies. See, normally a cookie is a type of is a small file that normally attach itself to the hard disk when you browse given websites, right? So these particular hardwares, they attach themselves to those particular cookies. So we have different types of cookies. There are those particular cookies that store your login information. So if they mix with these bad cookies, chances are the hacker or the attacker can steal your login information or those information within your website, rather within your hard disk, and use them. So they need to be handled, and they normally also suffocate the computer because once they start downloading, they cause some kind of they use a lot of resources behind the scene because they keep on feeding the server that released them with a lot of information. So your computer will tend to be a little bit sluggish. Uh, More so, we also have the spyware. Spyware are actually intentional. Hardwares are not really like intentional, but they can be misused. But for the spyware, now this is intentional, right? Malicious use of this particular software, right? So a hacker can come up with some kind of spyware just to capture some confidential information. And remember, we mentioned about confidentiality, right? So this is a breach on confidentiality. So we have additional threats that come from the spyware. Like we have the keyloggers is an example of a spyware. Keyloggers kind of monitor, right? Or does some kind of replay to what you're typing and sending it back so that they guess the right password, for example, right? So it's very, very important that users understand that we have the spywares and of course the Trojan programs. I've mentioned about this. Now Trojan itself comes in different shape, right? So you can't really say that, like for example, an hardware can come like a legit program, right? You think that now you're maybe subscribing to a given website or something, right? But ideally, behind the scenes, someone is collecting your information. So they always appear as legit programs, and it's very, very hard. That's now the problem with this Trojan. It's very hard to maybe to really tell whether this is the legit program or it's a fake program, right? And we have already mentioned about the backdoors and rootkits. So you can always see them, but they're used there for some kind of malicious purpose. So Trojan horse or Trojan programs are some kind of software-based attacks that are normally used to cause harm. Then we have reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is that kind of attack that the hacker use, or they kind of spread their techniques just to ensure that they understand the system architecture or the computer architecture and identify vulnerabilities within those particular system, right? So they'll always be trying to look at the weaknesses within the system, right? So they'll try and try and try. Once they realize that, okay, this port is not secure, they can use it for quite a number of things or damages. So when you have a systematic approach, or where the systematic use of some techniques to be able to gain access to our system, then that is reconnaissance. So what we need to do is to have some kind of intrusion detection systems in place, right? Just to enable us know maybe the attempt to a particular application from an authorized user, or an attempt to log into a Wi-Fi from an authorized user. So that will help us reinforce security. Example is the word dialing that normally is used, right? Maybe to see whether they can hack into the port of either a router or a modem and connect to the users within the network. We also have what we refer to as session hijacking. Now, this is not really software based, but of course it has some element of software in it. If that's why I said that it's very important for us to understand how a network operates. If you recall the 7 layers of the OSI model, we talked about the session layer. Now, the session layer allows two communicating processes to actually establish connection, right? Now, this connection is what we refer to as giving some session. Like, for example, if you want to download a file, right? So you kind of activate the connection so that you can download that particular file. If you want to request a page to a server, you kind of open a session with that particular server, right? So what happens if the session is open for data to be transmitted or for a file to be downloaded, and an attacker gets access to that particular session, right? They can use that session. So if you're downloading a file, for example, and the session is open to allow the file to download, the attacker can hijack that particular session, and instead of downloading a legit file, you end up downloading what? A virus, right? So it happens that we need to ensure that we have secure protocols. That is actually one of the ways to thwart this particular session hijacking. Talking about session hijacking, we also have TCP hijacking, which I think we're also going to look at in a few, right? So this session hijacking also can result to a breach in confidentiality. You've already seen someone can spy into what you are downloading. Someone can even prevent you from downloading. That is a breach to availability, right? Or whatever you are uploading or downloading, they can alter what you're downloading into something else. So it actually compromises what we have already mentioned, the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So remember how the session is normally crafted. So the session is open, data is transmitted, and then session terminated. So before it terminates, when it's open, that's where hijacking takes place, right? Right, I had this. So protection, you can use the secure protocols, right? Like the secure socket layer to ensure that if you're downloading file, use what? SFTP, secure file transfer protocol. If you are doing some kind of remote access to a file, you can use the secure shell, right? If you are downloading some confidential information, use the HTTPS. So these are just ways of reinforcing this kind of security so that we prevent it from hijacking. And you can see they are normally stored in the session cookie, right? So these cookies that I've mentioned, they are kind of lethal if they're not properly managed. Now, we also have eavesdropping. Eavesdropping, as we have mentioned, is an attack to the confidentiality. So hackers use different tactics to actually get access to your private information. They look for your passwords, credit cards, and so on. So eavesdropping include two forms of attack. Now, passive eavesdropping is where they just get the information, right? They have known that you use your password, or they can know that your password is your birthday, right? Then you have active. Now they use that password to log into your computer or other server and carry out some attack. Now we have different attacks. I said that we really can't talk about them, but also we have the use of weak keys, right? When you're looking at cryptography, you realize that if we don't really have some strong keys, right, then someone can hijack, as we have seen, our session and use it to send or receive files. Of course, we have the brute force attack, right? This one is also just the same as attacking the password, right? So we have brute force. I'm just going to mention them. Like we also have social engineering. Social engineering is done through different or strategies. Someone can send you an email, right, asking you for some private information. This email could be your friend. Maybe they've already tampered with your friend email, so they're using your friend email too. So since you trust your friend, they can always you can always give your friend the confidential information. And then later on, your friend will call you and tell you, my friend, I didn't send you that. So those are some kind of social engineering. Even a call from a particular organization or your bank, right? So they tell you that, you see, we are upgrading our systems and so on, and you give those kind of information. Now, we have the port scan as a form of attack. Now, this is trying to look at the weaknesses in the system, right? So they want to acquire the information and spring into action. We also have the dumpster diving attack. So this is attack that also is geared towards getting access to your private information. So some of them are more or less attacks to confidentiality. I've already looked at mathematical attacks. Now, mathematical attacks, they are very rare, but we need to have some kind of integrated kind of sequence to our keys. Like, it's not just enough to use, for example, public keys, right? You see, public keys, you share them. So the receiver knows the key and the sender knows the key. So we can add a little bit of private key there, right? And of course, also add some hash function, right? Just to ensure that we reinforce. Have you ever gone to some place and someone tells you to, first of all, put your finger biometric, then use the key to open. So there are quite a number of integrated security within the door for you to open it. The same thing, for us to prevent these mathematical attacks, right? We need to really ensure that our cryptography functions are really secure. Of course, we have the birthday attack, right? Now, the birthday attack is more or less the same as the mathematical attack. So if we're using cryptographic functions to actually secure our system, we need to ensure that we add the value, a unique value. We refer to it as a hash value. It should actually be very complicated, and that's why we have different hash functions. So it depends, maybe with how you reinforce your security. So hash functions are like just like padlocks. So you can decide to use a weak hash function or a weak padlock, or go for an expensive padlock to avoid these forms of attack. I've mentioned about the backdoor. I've also mentioned ideally about the spoofing, right? So it kind of, someone can, or the end device can think that this particular communication is coming from a particular server by just looking at the IP address. So spoofing is kind of just changing or tricking the target system to think that this particular information is actually from a particular sender. Now, what we need to know about IP spoofing is that this spoofing happens within the network layer of the OSI model, because IP is what transmits the packets. And you see, when you look at how a packet is packaged, it has quite a number of elements. It has the source IP address, the destination IP address, it has the different header information and so on. So IP spoofing, an attacker can learn and use those particular information to trick, right, the end device into accepting, right, that particular packet, and therefore they can use this to cause a lot of problem. Now, man in the middle, I also mentioned this, right? So it's just a strategy also of interrupting the normal communication flow. So once someone has eavesdropped, they can recreate, right, by understanding the IP address of the source, right? They can recreate some kind of like a rogue. We can have a rogue access point, for example, right? So instead of using the original or the main access point, you can be directing traffic to the wrong access point or even the router, and therefore you are going to be receiving communication from a different server or a different network altogether. So we can handle this by actually also using the secure protocols. That is one that can always handle this kind of unwanted traffic. Replay, as I mentioned, is a kind of attack. I mentioned about the keylogger, right? Targeted, for example, to the session layer, right? It tries to send all conversation into establishing the connection that was already done, right? So if the hacker realizes that you're using an FTP to download a file, right, it'll try to use the session that it had already captured. So it will try to kind of replay the connection so that it attempts to connect again, right? So if it gets through to that, it starts downloading those particular files. How do we stop it? Of course, as I mentioned, we can have firewalls first. Firewalls can be able to detect those particular unwanted packets or session codes, what we refer to as the session cookies. We can still use the secure protocols. I'll emphasize on protocols because this is the only way that you can always monitor. It will monitor on your behalf and block those particular unwanted traffic on your behalf. Now look, we also have TCP hijacking, same to session hijacking. Now what is TCP, right? Transmission Control Protocol. Now this is found within the transport layer. The work of a TCP is to be able to establish connection. First, there are layers of how communication happens within the transport layer. Transport layer is given the mandate to deliver, for delivery of packets, what we refer to as the segments. So therefore, the TCP ensures that it can establish the connection securely and ensure that the end device receives what exactly was sent, right? So if you are expecting a package from me as your lecturer, let's say you are expecting your final result, then someone else tampers with that particular result, right? And then it looks like I'm the one who gave you that particular result, only to you to find that it was someone else who actually got access to that result and gave it to you. So TCP is about hijacking those particular chunk of data, right, before they reach to the recipient, and of course they can always be seen by the recipient or rather end device, and they might think that it comes from the original system. There's quite some noise interference from my side. There's a lot of noise. There's some kids playing around. Now, so what can the hacker gain with this? Of course, confidentiality. They can be able to capture what is being transmitted, right? They can be able to alter. In fact, TCP hijacking since it involves quite a number of protocols. We also have the UDP, TCP and UDP, right? TCP is a bit safe, that's why it's being hijacked, right? So you can always reinforce this by having secure protocols, right? So the protocols that you're using to transport this particular data should be very, very secure. Now, fragmentation attack is actually what I was trying to also talk about. Now, fragmentation attack is whereby if a particular packet consists of different elements. So if a particular packet is subdivided into smaller pieces, a hacker can use or inject a particular piece within those fragmented data. And when the receiving computer is actually trying to assemble, it is very difficult for them to identify, right? That there's a kind of a fishy packet inside that, right? And once it receives, there's no way of actually taking it back. So it's more or less the same as the TCP hijacking. Fragmentation of data normally happens within the data link layer. That is the second layer of the OSI model. So you can see we are just trying to kind of bring what we learned in within the network systems and understanding how these attacks happen and how we can prevent them. So I've already mentioned about the IP spoofing. You can see, so here it is. What happens? The hacker here tries to create some denial of service attack. So it sends quite a number of voluminous traffic to the end computer. So what happens? There's some kind of spoofing. Spoofing simply means trying to look as if it comes from the original sender, right? With an intention. So the sender has an intention of creating some denial of service attack, right? Sending a lot of traffic. So from this diagram, maybe you can pick 2 or 3 things. So you can see the attacker here. Attacker is trying to use the source, the destination, the source IP address, right? The real IP address you can see is 111, but it's trying to forge, right? So that this particular the source IP address you can see here, it's picking the source IP address to come from the router, right? So the victim might think that okay, this is the real router, right? But it is using some kind of spoofing strategy to send a lot of unwanted traffic. What happens? A lot of traffic is received. The source, or the target device is overwhelmed. It cannot respond to requests, right? So sometimes people will say, start complaining. I'm sending the print. I'm sending some kind of print request. I can't be able to print. I'm trying to download a file. I cannot be able to download a file. So those are some of the IP spoofing that can happen. TCP, hijacking, sessions. These are just more or less the same things. So spoofing is known as one of actually denial of service attacks that you can always get, right? You have dictionary attack targeted to your password. For those of us who have configured a Linux system, you realize that Linux had some issues with storing of password, right? So this dictionary password was really targeted to the folder. It is the etc, right? So etc, it had a very weak folder that people could just get access to. So the dictionary attack was launched to ensure that they can be able to get those particular passwords. But what happened? There's some secure folder that was brought about to encrypt the passwords. So passwords can now be turned into alphanumeric. And that's why in the normal areas that you're using your passwords, let's say Gmail, it's always advisable you use what? Alphanumeric, right? So that someone cannot easily use a dictionary attack and get access to your files or folder. This is more or less the same TCP attacks. I've already mentioned this, so it's part of the TCP hijacking, right? We have also mentioned different types of denial of service attacks. Very many. Actually, if we talk about denial of service attack, it's like as its own. We can talk about a whole chapter, right? Because there are very many. Any attack that denies availability or we can't access a resource, that is a denial of service attack. It is actually an attack that can bring the entire network down within seconds, right? Even when you're logging in to a network, you cannot be able to log in if there are those particular denial of service attack. Examples of denial of service attacks, already I've mentioned them and you know them. We have the SMARF. I think we are going to look at them. Now, even loss of bandwidth, right? When you have very many unwanted traffic being sent, those are, yeah, so it degrades the speed of the network. As we mentioned, it is the worst form of attack because dealing with this is very hard, right? It's even difficult to know where it's coming from because all the traffic looks legit, right? All the traffic looks legit until you understand that this is where this particular problem comes. So we also have this well-known kind of denial of service attack known as SMARF, right? SMARF is the example that we have seen from the diagram, right? So it kind of uses uses or hijacks a particular computer's IP address and broadcasts, right? What is broadcasting? Broadcast simply means sending some kind of data to the entire systems that are connected to them, to the computer, right? So when it sends, then what happens? The main sender, leave alone the spoof, the fake sender, the main sender will now get requests. If it was a server, it is now going to get requests from all these particular systems within the network, right? So it is actually a very bad kind of attack, as you can see, right? So we have the attacker and the victim. So the attacker is the fake sender, right, or the fake request, right? Then the victim here, whose original IP address is used by the attacker. So because these particular computers that are connected to the network know the victim, so they are going to bombard. That's going to send a lot of feedback to the same computer. So it gets overwhelmed and it can't be able to function anymore. So as I mentioned, we have different types of attacks. We have buffer overflow. We know what buffer is, right? So it keeps on sending a lot of data that cannot be handled by the destination computer. So what happens? The system can crash. We also have the synchronization attack, the SYN attack, right? So you can always handle this. Synchronization is more or less the session that you have already looked at, right? So having open connections can lead to this. You also have teardrop attack, right? It's more or less the fragmentation attack that we looked at, right? So it keeps on playing with the fragments of data, changing the number, and of course you've seen the SMARF attack. So this lady here is complaining that the computer is slow. So that could be SMARF attack, right? So they can carry quite a number of countermeasures that we're going to see how to deal with these. We also have packet sniffing, more or less the same as eavesdropping. Now, we are told to recall how Ethernet works, right? Now, Ethernet is whereby we have communication happening within the second layer of the OSI model. we have Ethernet communication, and of course we have the token ring communication. Now, Ethernet communication, if computers want to communicate within an Ethernet network, what happens is that one computer takes charge, and first of all check whether the line is free, in what we refer to as collision detection, right? Carrier sense, to check whether the line is free. So we have the carrier sense and see whether there is some collision, right? So it does the collision detection. It has the collision detection mechanism, and of course we also have the collision avoidance. Now, what is this in the packet sniffing scenario? When a particular computer wants to communicate within Ethernet, first of all, it does what we refer to as, it broadcasts. So there's a very poor communication within Ethernet. So it broadcasts the packets, right? So this issue of broadcasting the packet, we can broadcast it to a wrong computer, right? A computer that is not actually supposed to get this particular packet, and this could create a lot of collision. That is one, because it's going to be responding to the request, right, from this particular computer. Also, the problem with this packet sniffing is that it's going to have multiple replication of unwanted traffic, right? So every communicating device will always find that the line is busy, and so there's no communication that is going to happen. And of course, there will be a lot of collision, because every computer wants to send their packet. So it is the strategy that the rogue computers can, someone can use a rogue computer, someone can use a rogue router or an access point, just to have different packets being released to the network. So we can have some firewalls. We can also have what we refer to as the secure protocols that I had already mentioned, right? Just to ensure that we don't have these kind of collisions, or rather many traffic being directed to the network, right? A good way also to solve these packet issues is to use the IP security, right? IP security is one of the solutions that you can always have within this particular network layer or data link layer to prevent unwanted packets from being transmitted. Now, as I mentioned, I've not really even gone halfway about these particular forms of threats and attacks, and that's why I've shared some additional notes within the module, so that at least you reinforce the understanding of this. Maybe briefly, let's look at how we can, of course you have already seen some measures that you can use to protect ourselves, but what else can we do to defend ourselves against these particular attacks? Now, there are several defense mechanisms or techniques that you can use, right? We can use physical protection of the computers, locking them down. You can use firewalls, you can use antiviruses, you can update the softwares. These are just the normal ones, right? Like, for example, if you have some kind of attack on the network and you realize that it is coming from a particular computer, right? Maybe the one thing that you are told is maybe to isolate it and remove it from the network. That could also be something that is not mentioned here. So we have seen about IP spoofing, and these are the ways that you can, these are things that you can do to prevent IP spoofing. One good way of stopping a rogue IP or a computer from using someone else's IP is configuring a firewall. right? Now, a firewall can be a software or a hardware. More so when you look at an example of a router, right? If you guys, if you are here and you have not done some kind of let's say CCNA, CCNA will enable you to have that hands-on experience in configuring maybe different routers. You can configure access lists, right? Access lists are those ones that are going to maybe stop unwanted IP addresses from getting access to a particular network. And of course, it can also monitor if there's some kind of IP addresses that are trying to replay, right, some sessions and so on. So it's the best way to have a router being configured as a firewall. And you see the main role of a firewall is ideally to filter incoming traffic and outgoing traffic. So it can intercept these and reject those particular unwanted traffic. Now the other one is just to use some encryption during session, as you had already mentioned, right? Sessions are also a venue that most hackers will use as a playing ground, right? If it's not well protected through encryptions, then we can have issues. We also have physical protection of the system, right? So there are quite a number of strategies that you can employ, right? Like locking down the computer, and looking at the computer architecture that we mentioned. Computer architecture, you need to understand what are the most targeted parts of the computer. So we have the CMOS or the BIOS. This is a firmware, right, that the hacker can be able to maybe access, right, and delete. You see, boot up or the BIOS consists of very essential boot up information, so they can use it, right? So this is complementary metal oxide basic input output system. So we can always safeguard our boot password or have it, right? Also disable floppy or CD. Now there are those particular computers that you'll never have it. You'll never find any CD-ROM drive, right? Because what happens, someone can change the boot up sequence to boot from their CD, not from your hard disk, and they can do a lot of damage from that, right? Before the systems were actually improved, I remember there are times when accessing a computer was just very easy, right? So we just had a boot. We had we had some software within the CD, so you just bypass the login credentials and you do stuff, right? So this still can happen. So we need to do that. Software update is another strategy that we often ignore. Like I can see my laptop requires some update, but because I'm using it, I'm just trying to postpone, which is not a good thing, right? We should always give priority to this if there's an update. You see, operating system has a way of communicating or rather defending itself. So once it realizes that there's some kind of vulnerabilities, it tries to update or create some patching, right, to eradicate these vulnerabilities or rather loopholes. So we can use that. Of course, malwares, as I mentioned, let your users understand how or these particular softwares that are not legit, for example. Use antiviruses to remove these. You can also better reinforce this by use of firewall, right? So those are some of just countermeasures We also have protection of user accounts. Now this one starts from the time you create account. Is this account still active? Because you see, if you just create an account and you can't be able to determine whether the account is active or not, hackers will always look. Those are the things that we're talking about, right? Scanning the system. So if they realize that there's this account that is not being used, it's dormant, they can always use that. So how will you know, right? How will you know that this is not the legit employee, for example? Of course, also you can work on some limitation, right? Disable use of old accounts. Use now. This is a policy, and that's inform us of what we're going to talk about in our next lesson. Yeah, formulation or rather coming up with a proper network policy. Right, a good proper network policy should outline how you are going to handle these or how users should handle their accounts. Right, so that's one strategy of protecting ourselves. And of course, files, network systems. Who is responsible to access a particular file? So you should provide the right permissions, or what we refer to as rights, right? Remove any unnecessary files from the system, scan them, right? And ensure that you can pinpoint the unwanted files. Same to application, right? Disable attachments in emails. Okay, I really don't see how this can, but try just to have some automated scanning system that every email attachment should be scanned, right? How do we prevent the TCP hijacking? We already mentioned this, right? So IP security provides the right legit way of knowing who or which application is talking to which application, right? So it offers some layer of protection, the IP security. I believe we are still going to look at it, right? We're talking about the network security protocols. It's one of the network protocols that will always be used to enforce security. And we also have the social problems. Now, social problems originate from human beings, right? As I'd mentioned, a lot of threats come from users, right? Users are very vulnerable. They can be easily compromised into causing harm, right? A user is someone who you can tell them, my friend, there's a job that is somewhere, leave that place, let's get for you this job, but with the condition that you tell us or you get for us this information. So let's assume that you are the system admin, someone is offering you a high paying job. Let's say it's even the competitor of the same organization, they're offering you, but they want you to maybe steal some vital information and give them. I know majority of us will do that, right? Right. That's just one angle to look at it, right? And how do we prevent these, right? Now, these are social issues. So it's really very hard to give 100% solution. Maybe thorough education, right, can help handle these particular problems. Those are the things that you can do to employees, right? I had at some point we were working with a particular organization, and the system admin had a lot of issues with the employees, and you realize that most system admins, they're not friendly. And I used to blame this particular guy. I didn't understand, right? Because people didn't like him. One, because he was blocking people accessing maybe some Facebook, some websites, right? He didn't want people to install, limiting you to have rights to install programs. So he was just alone, isolated within the the organization. So these are some of the roles that you guys might face. You don't, if you joke around with users, then you can jeopardize your job, and you can also jeopardize the entire organization. So I think sometimes when we look at these network admins or IT guys, people don't like us a lot, right? But we know what you're protecting, right? Because you really handle a lot of things. If you get compromised, then the entire system goes down. We had a case where someone was murdered. I know you guys know about that, right? Just to have their fingerprint to unlock some system, right? So anyway, that's just a story because you're talking about social problems, but it gets to an extent that if you want to secure the system as a network admin, as a network security expert, you really need to put your feet down, because you can be easily compromised. And if you are compromised, then everything can go haywire. So those are some of the, just a little bit of attack, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures. So I believe through research and looking at the notes that I've provided within the within this particular module platform, we can be able to reinforce our understanding on how to secure the network.